Good morning. My name is Graham Brookie, and I'm the Vice President for Technology Programs and Strategy here at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to welcome you this morning to a conversation with Aarti Holla-Maini, Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, to discuss the growing role of the private sector in international space collaboration. By the end of the decade, it is expected that the global space economy will reach $1 trillion. This figure encompasses increased investment by governments and also includes the private sector. From internet services enabled by satellites to the continuous observation of Earth, local space activities have changed the way that societies function and how we understand our planet. As we go back to the moon, venture deeper into the solar system, and find practical ways to use space capabilities to improve life here on Earth, it's essential that we collaborate. This notion is at the heart of the work here at the Atlantic Council to shape the global future together. And from the first time humans explored space, coordination with international partners has been essential to ensuring mission success and safety when thousands of miles beyond our planet. Today's conversation will explore the roles of and facilitation between governments, companies, and international organizations like the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. I want to thank everybody for joining this morning here in Washington, D.C., and to those tuning in here from around the world. Thank you to our Geotech Center space team, including Ellie Creasy for her work in organizing today's event, and Dr. Raoul Brenz Jr. Thank you to Jacqueline Fletcher, Managing Editor of Payload, an innovative news outlet covering the business and policy for space, for moderating today's conversation. And thank you so much to Aarti and her team for making time in what seems to be an extraordinarily busy schedule to join us here today. Over to you, Jacqueline, to launch into it.
Well, great. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this conversation. I know I'm so excited to sit down with you on your first visit to the U.S. and hear a little bit about what you've been doing, both over in Vienna and here. So to start off with, in case any of our audience are unfamiliar, can you talk a little bit about what is the UN's Office of Outer Space Affairs, and how does it fit into the web of other space policy structures that are out there?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm very grateful to the Atlantic Council for all that they do. I've joined the UN system only 6.5 months ago after spending my whole career in industry. So I'm learning as I go at this point and trying to understand the system. But UNUSA was actually formed back in 1957 as an expert unit within the UN Secretariat. And it was formed to support what was then an ad hoc committee on the peaceful uses of outer space, known as COPA. It grew over the years, and in 1992 it became OSAD, the Office of Space Affairs Division, Outer Space Affairs Division in the Secretariat, and in 93 it moved to Vienna and was called UNUSA officially. Meanwhile, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is a permanent feature where we convene all of the UN member states, and that has been the home, the birthplace of all of the treaties, principles, resolutions, and guidelines that underpin today's space economy, all of them. So we are, on the one hand, Secretariat to COPUS. We are Secretariat also to the Intergovernmental Committee on Global Navigation Satellite Systems, where again we convene the different providers, the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, with Galileo, GPS, GLONASS, Beidou, and so on, so that they can discuss interoperability and cooperation coordination. So half of our mandate is the Secretariat function. From space law and treaties, governance, all the way to planetary defense and making sure that all member states are aware of if there's an asteroid threat coming, this kind of thing. And then the other half of our work, which was not there at the outset of our office, at the establishment of our office, is capacity building. We do capacity building for the United Nations member states to really make sure that that member states understand and can benefit from all that space technology, data and services has to offer. And as I said, that wasn't thought of when UNUSA was established back in the day. I think we see a lot of UN offices being established more recently in recent years, like counterterrorism, the Office for Youth. And if we were setting up, I think if the United Nations was establishing this office now, it would probably be very different to what it was when it was set up.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, given how much the industry has changed since then. Yeah. You mentioned that you recently left industry to come to the United Nations. What was the driver in taking this new job? What was the appeal of being at, as you say, the center of all these treaties and kind of setting the standards for international space exploration?
I will say I'm not a space lawyer, and the assumption is that if you work for UNUSA, that's what you do. I actually struggle to remember the full names of all the 5 main treaties, so I'll be perfectly frank with you. But for me, I had spent a long time in industry. I was Secretary General of the Global Satellite Operators Association, and to be very tangible, what I did well was being the ambassador for the satellite communications sector, and I often got criticized by my members because in our publications, sometimes I would advocate around the benefits of these services, and I wouldn't necessarily even mention the word satellite. And my members would say, yeah, but you haven't even mentioned the word satellite. And you're meant to be promoting us and our companies and our work. And I said, look, you don't actually need to talk about the technology. It's the service, it's the difference that it makes to people's lives, to governments, to businesses, to schools, and so on, that really counts. And so in transitioning to this role, I almost feel that it tunes in finer to where I want to go and what I would like to achieve with it. So perhaps that gives you some insight into the move from industry to this role.
Absolutely, and you've led in very well to my next question about how space does impact life on Earth. Commercial providers obviously play a critical role in the space ecosystem now that was probably not the case when the office was established. But how have you seen commercial capabilities in orbit impact life on Earth?
So that is, it's a big question. It would have a very big answer, but if I can give you perhaps a couple of examples. We have, on the one hand, totally invisible outcomes from developing space capabilities, which is the spin-off technologies that are now embedded into our daily lives. Whether it's the memory foam in your bed, whether it's the escalators when you're going to the underground system, so that's on the one hand. But what's really, really impressive, really exciting is when you think that without imagery from space, we wouldn't even know that there's a climate crisis. In Kenya, we have 245 schools who are connected, isolated in the very corners, the deepest, remotest corners of the country, where normally there's no terrestrial infrastructure at all. And you have children being able to access maths with a project online. And if I can stay with that example for a second, the satellite operator involved, they did all they measured the impact of this case study. They worked with the Kenyan government and with the other providers, and they saw that by giving children access to a 15 megabit per second internet connection, which is not 5G or anything like that, it's the most basic of connectivity, and by giving them access to 1 hour per week, they were able to increase the learning age by 18 months. So wow. That's so powerful. But what's really impressive is that when you dig a little bit deeper and you see, well, okay, how much does that cost? Because you're taking complex space technology and you're bringing it out into the sticks where there's nothing. You have power issues, you have electricity, and all of basic issues in these areas. Well, the answer is $3 per child per year. Sorry, $3 per child per year. That's less than the cost of a Starbucks every morning, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one example. We could talk about so many others in deforestation. Climate change is such a massive issue right now. I know that a company like Planet, thanks to the high resolution imagery that they have provided, in Brazil they prevented, I think it was 40 illegal raids. And why? Because using that kind of high resolution imagery from space, you can see through clouds, you can see very precise details. You could actually see the fine line of a road which is being deforested into a very big dense forest, where then the equipment will be driven in to start the illegal activity. And by seeing with that precision from space, they were able to prevent 40 actions of illegal deforestation. There are numerous examples. I could carry on forever, and I think they're really inspiring. But just to give you a sense of the difference that we can make with Earth observation, satellite imagery on the one hand, satellite communications on the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very inspirational what space can do. Part of the reason I love covering it is that it's so inspirational. So you've talked about the fact that the UN previously has been focused on a lot of these big treaties, working government to government, specifically in the space realm. But we just talked about all this very exciting technology in the commercial sector. So how is the UN trying to harness that innovation in the commercial sector, and what challenges does that pose compared to working directly government to government?
For me, in my observation, I'm so new to the UN, and I didn't work in the public sector before, so I'm really observing with a great sense of objectivity and trying to figure out, how does the system work, and how much flexibility do we have to not change it per se, but introduce some novel angles which will be appreciated by the member states who are there. And I've already seen that. So member states, especially within the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, are deliberating on really important issues, whether it's space for global health, whether it's issues of space governance and the long-term sustainability guidelines or things like that. They really are deliberating on matters which are of fundamental importance to answer today's questions in this field. And when we bring private industry to, for example, make a technical presentation, they realize that, wow, we didn't know that these innovations were happening. We didn't know the state of industry or our collective ability, for example, to remove debris from orbit. We didn't know that Japan, for example, has introduced guidelines to put a license in place for active debris removal, the only country in the world to have done so. Now, if we want to scale these kind of examples, surely we need that knowledge to be wider disseminated so that other countries can also put such licenses and such guidelines in place, right? So by involving the private sector, we can bring a more dynamic approach, but fundamentally we can inform the decisions and hopefully accelerate some of the very necessary decision-making that has to happen within the committee and perhaps more generally in policy all over the world.
You talked about debris removal, which is an area that there are other areas as well, but specifically debris removal is something I've covered before, where companies are kind of banding together and putting out sets of best practices on their own, or working with other non-governmental organizations on non-binding agreements. How do you think those are helpful to have kind of these industry-led standards outside of a body like the UN? And how do you kind of approach those sort of standards that are set outside of a major body like that?
I think it's very unfortunate when we have to start arguing about mandates and who should do what. I think we have to be very realistic and pragmatic. The reality is that with the current state of geopolitics around the world, we are going to have to move forward in the field of space governance in a different way to what we've seen previously. There was a time for global treaties and so on, but what we see now is, as it was harder to find consensus, we shifted more towards a time of guidelines, and most recently long-term sustainability guidelines, which were adopted by consensus. They took as long as any treaty would to negotiate negotiate. But the good thing about them is, would you rather have negotiated a treaty which would have been an agenda item in the committee all the way until it was adopted, and then remove that agenda item and wait for member states to ratify? Look what happened with the Moon Treaty. How many have ratified it? Very few, right? So would we rather be in that scenario, or would we be in the situation which we are in now, which is we have a set of guidelines which can evolve, which are being complemented by member states now negotiating a new guidelines, new additional guidelines, and which we can work with as and the committee has this as an ongoing agenda item. We're now working with member states to help them implement it. And it's so important that member states understand the nitty-gritty within these guidelines. For example, there is one which talks about sharing data in order to prevent collisions in space, and so on. So these were developed by the experts who sit within the committee, who may be space agencies, ministries of foreign affairs. In the case of the US, it's state representatives, but also NASA representatives. But the people within member states who are likely to implement these guidelines and take them and turn them into norms and binding rules may be the telecoms regulator. It may be a space agency, it may not be. So it's not necessarily the interlocutors who sit within the committee. So there's a huge responsibility on us to engage with others who are talking about rules, who are considering rules, be they civil society and non-public sector players, be they regulators. So as I said, we have to have a pragmatic approach. It's a waste of time to be arguing about mandates. We know what is our mandate, and we will continue to do what we can in the context in which we are working, which is not an easy one. But at the same time, initiatives also by the private sector, for example, GSOA, the Global Satellite Operator Association, where I worked previously, recently adopted a code of conduct. This is showing us that satellite operators are coming together to see, okay, what can we do? It's not going to be binding on us, but still, what is the lowest common denominator where we do agree? And perhaps it informs individual operators to go an extra mile, because maybe it helps them in terms of showing what good behavior looks like, what responsible behavior looks like, right? So I think we need to embrace all of what's happening, but we must really see how can we move from recommendations and guidelines to really empowering member states to embed them into their national policy making.
So you've touched on this, but looking to go just a little bit deeper, you've touched on all of the varied stakeholders, from state to space agencies to industry, that can and should be involved in these kinds of discussions. So I'm looking to get your thoughts on kind of where these discussions should be had. There are UN-hosted events, there are various trade shows like Space Symposium, where I understand you'll be next week, NATO meetings, there's the space adjacent, like the UN's climate change conference. Do you have thoughts on kind of where these conversations should be focused?
So that is such an important question. And I not so long ago, in February, had a penny drop moment on precisely this question, because indeed we have events and useful discussions happening in many different fora, and in principle that is always good. It's always good to talk. It's always good to advance your thinking and see where does that take us, what new avenues and ideas might we have to make progress on some of the critical issues that are facing us. The problem I see is that being in the UN, the UN as a whole is at an inflection point. COPA and UNUSA are also at inflection points. It's very easy to throw stones at the United Nations. At the highest level, at the more technical level like we said, it's very easy to do that and say, oh, it's not delivering. You cannot blame the United Nations for individual member state politics. It really is as simple as that. But why am I saying this? Because COPA has had stones thrown at it for, we need a new global treaty, we need binding rules, COPA is not delivering, it's deadlocked, they don't progress. But if you're going to have valuable and important discussions, for example, the Saudi Space Agency hosted a fantastic conference on active debris removal in February, a 2-day conference with every relevant stakeholder to that topic being present. Really, really great, both at institutional level, industry level. But none of the decision makers, the policy makers who reflect on these questions within the committee which does have the unequivocal mandate on this, were there. Because Vienna is the hub where these discussions happen. So we have to find ways of bringing more such important discussions and dialogues to the policymakers. And because we have space attaches sitting within the permanent missions in Vienna, because we have a structural dialogue which has a formal mandate from the UN General Assembly, which takes place religiously almost in Vienna, we have to make sure that the discussions happen there. So that goes to 2 things. It goes to one, organizing more events and meetings in Vienna around the existing structure of the COPAs, which we have a scientific and technical subcommittee which meets in February, we have a legal subcommittee which meets in April, and we have a plenary meeting which takes place in June, each of which is 2 weeks long. That goes one to that point. And secondly, it goes to the point of how do we find ways of bringing non-governmental actors to be more involved in the committee itself. And there I mentioned member states bringing industry representatives onto their delegations, inviting them to make technical presentations, or us working with member states to organize side events during the committee, to really keep the decision makers abreast of the latest developments and make sure that their status of knowledge is as advanced as the technology development in the sector. It's not obvious, but that's how we need to work.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. So the space industry, there are obviously exceptions to this. There are space companies everywhere, but space industry is primarily headquartered in a couple areas, the US, Europe, Japan. Do you have thoughts on kind of how those companies can, or how companies in those countries can work with, companies in emerging space nations to help, sort of give emerging space nations a domestic space capability?
Yeah, so we have a lot of member states, not a lot, we have countries in the emerging economies, right, who would love to have their own satellite. It's a matter of national prestige. It's a matter of advancing STEM and technology development in their countries. So this does happen. In principle, should we be encouraging countries to launch new satellites? I mean, you might say from a space sustainability point of view, nah, that's not necessarily what we should be doing. But for me, I think we need to accelerate progress on so many different things. And one of those things is socioeconomic development and moving the needle on different sustainable development goals, whether it's healthcare for all, primary education for all, climate change related issues, sustainable marine life and all of that, where all of these things where space makes a difference. Do you mind repeating your question? Because I think I've distracted myself.
No, you're fine. It's how should companies in kind of these hotbeds of space activity or space commercial activity, can or should they be working with emerging space nations to kind of spread the wealth in terms of commercial capability?
I would not put the motivation on commercial capability. For me, should we let companies should we wait for commercial interest to align with policy objectives of bridging the digital divide, of enabling healthcare for all, education for all? Or should we embed it by design so that the capacity building that our office does actually leverages the strengths that lie within private industry in terms of knowledge and capabilities, in terms of funding and resources, in order to accelerate progress on what we do? For me, that's the point. So we do capacity building, And we call upon experts when we do that. For example, we run a program called UN SPIDER, Space-Based Information for Disaster and Emergency Relief. In the last 5 years, we have run, I think it's 41 technical advisory missions where we have gone out and worked with, in any given country, 6 to 9 different ministries to see what is the need in this country, how can we help you build resilience. So SPIDER is all about disaster relief. Very often we find they cannot access space data. They need essential space data. We can help access space data for them, but we can't do it without partnering with private industry. We already have agreements in place with Maxar, with Airbus. With Maxar, we have put in place an open data initiative, but we need to do a lot more of this. And we can't do it without private industry. So it's not really about the enabling technology transfer, enabling technological capabilities. But it is about empowering member states and giving them the capabilities to become resilient and to grow themselves.
So I want to turn to talk about the Space Bridge program, which you launched late last year. Can you talk a little bit about what it is and why you think it's important?
There is, the whole world works in silos. I mean, silos exist in any field, whether you're talking public sector, private sector, or any organization struggles with silos. And we talked a lot about the need to bring private sector into the decisions that are taken on space governance, but also on moving the needle on the SDGs. That's already one silo that we need to break down. So for me, the United Nations Space Bridge is a way to bridge the gap, be it between space and non-space, be it between public sector, space agencies and decision makers and industry, be it between space agencies on the one hand and telecoms regulators on the other. There are so many different bridges that need to be built in order to foster a dialogue and to advance together on critical questions. So that was the thinking behind that. And we think that there are many important questions that need to be asked, but more importantly, answered. And big challenges require multiple partners. And that's why we need to find what are the right questions that need to be asked, who are the relevant experts that need to be convened around those questions in order to come up with ideas and avenues of how to advance on them. So we are already going to be convening 2 USBs this year. One will be with UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, in Nairobi, I hope later this year, which is all about atmospheric ablation. We are learning that there is impacts on the atmosphere, both from launches, the plume from launches going up into space, but more importantly from the amount of satellites and debris which is burning up in the atmosphere. And the UNEP stakeholders, which are concerned with environment, they had asked their United Nations counterpart, UNEP, surely this is of relevance to us. We don't know anything about it. So UNEP reached out to UNUSA and said, this is your domain. And we were able to say, yeah, of course. And we know that there is important research happening in this field. So we will be bringing together some space experts around this to talk to the environmental community. You see, so we're bridging one bridge there already. Another one, which is perhaps closer to home and more obvious, is around space situational awareness. We know that there are so many systems there. Some are public. In the US, you had JSPOC, which is now COMSPOC, and 18th, and so on. You're developing the track system here. In the European Union, you have EU SST. You also have systems which were born out of the private sector, such as the Space Data Association, which is now a public-private initiative. You have NOAA, NASA, EUMETSAT, all members of that. You have many different experts, some public, some private, and also civil society, who we believe should be convened, because ultimately we need a global space traffic management system. The United Nations is not going to become an operational entity like that, but as the UN, what do we have? We have this unique convening power to bring the relevant stakeholders to the table and to make progress. And so we hope to do that around the General Assembly taking place at the end of October in New York. A couple of examples of how the USB should work.
Yes. So I saw when the Spacebridge program was established in December, you announced the beginning of a process to identify specific topics that you'd address this year. So these are the two topics, the SSA and the environmental?
You know, new questions and new topics are coming up all the time, but we are kind of the Cinderella of the UN system, unfortunately. And I think that goes back to the fact that we were created with a sole function of being a secretariat to a committee, and without the notion of we are actually we carry this huge responsibility of being the Secretary General's custodian of space for the Sustainable Development Goals. So this whole capacity building mandate that we have is a massive responsibility, because we're the only part of the UN that has a mandate entirely dedicated to space. So we're an outfit which is 25 people on United Nations regular budget, and perhaps another 10 on extra budgetary resources, which is secondees from member states. So it's a very small office. There's only a limited amount that we can do. So for the moment, we have these two in the planning. I attended a tabletop exercise on planetary defense just 2 days ago. Another idea came out of that we should have a USB where we actually try to involve developing countries into this dialogue. So it's very important for us that whether it's on planetary defense, whether it's on solar weather, or all of areas where many countries around the world don't have knowledge and capabilities, that we use our convening power to ensure that this important knowledge is disseminated as wide as possible, right? You will find brilliant minds in every country, and a country may not be a spacefaring nation, but for sure they will have experts and researchers who can potentially contribute to these fields as well. So lots of ideas are coming, and this is perhaps an area where the private sector can help. We would welcome working with private sector reps or civil society representatives who have ideas for, let's do a space bridge on this topic. We can host it, we can support the organization of it, very open to that. The question is just, more realistically time. Given such a small office, and I'm very new, but I bring I guess, a set of expertise which wasn't in the office previously. So the vision is very much that the office needs to grow. If we're going to deliver on the expectations of the member states, on the expectations of the Secretary General himself. You have perhaps heard of the Summit of the Future, which is taking place in September. There is a space policy brief. Everybody knows that space is this important. If space is this important, then UNUSA should also be that important. And it is, but we must put our money where our mouth is, really. And so I hope to be able to drum up support both from the UN system to appreciate the relevance and the impact and the potential of the office to move the needle on these issues, but also invite and inspire member states to help us help them, and to inspire countries in the global north to help us help the global south as well.
Do you have a wish list, or how many people do you think the office needs to really meet these expectations and be able to do the work you've laid out?
I don't really do dreaming. I prefer to keep feet on the ground and be very realistic, start small. Well, I'm definitely starting small, there's no doubt about that. But for me, this office has to be 100 people within 1 to 2 years. It really has to be, because it's simply not sustainable for me personally, for the staff in the office, and it's, why are we here? I mean, it is a big responsibility. We have what it takes to do it. I'm no stranger to having to punch above our weight. I ran a global trade association with 2 staff members, and we pushed back on mobile terrestrial to defend satellite spectrum very, very successfully for many years. So we have the brains to be able to do that, but we do need resources as well. There's only so much you can do with being resourceful. You need resources as well. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about your trip to the U.S. this week. This is your first trip to the U.S. since taking office. You're in D.C. and then heading out to Colorado next week. What message are you bringing from Vienna, and what information are you trying to bring home?
A lot of people don't know that UNUSA and COPAs exist. I tell you, 7 months ago, when I was not yet part of the United Nations, I was still an industry representative. I knew they existed, but I really wasn't too concerned about the mandate or the impact, the relevance to what I was doing. And I'm sure there's I'm sure the space industry is also wondering that. And the message that I bring from my own objective observation of this system is, wow, I feel that we are almost unashamedly doing business development for the space sector as a whole, because we are promoting the benefit of space services, space data, space technology. So without meaning to be the BD arm for a whole swath of companies, I feel that we kind of are. And that's an opportunity for the space sector to put its best foot forward. But for me, it's an opportunity to really make a difference on the ground on so many different policy objectives. What I'm taking away is a greater understanding of how UNUSA can be more impactful. I'm hearing from US government departments, different offices, what they would like to achieve, what they would like to see. And I'm able to engage with them to see almost, okay, how can we work together to achieve this? And what strikes me the most is that even though we know there's a lot of politics at play right now in the real world, in my bilateral engagements with the different important actors, the ambitions are very, very, very similar, if not almost identical. People want to achieve the same goals. There is just a whole lot of mistrust and misunderstandings because of the lack of communication. And the lack of communication comes because of the political positions. This country is not allowed to engage with representatives of the other country. Well, you will not overcome your problems if you do not engage. So there I really hope to foster a much greater understanding that if you can't talk to this person, maybe you can if I'm in the room. If the United Nations is in the room, they said, yeah, but then we can. Great. So let's focus on what we can do and not what we can't do in order to make a difference.
So we've talked a lot about multilateral fora. You may have seen in DC, all the Japanese flags are up. There is a Japanese official visit next week where the Japanese Prime Minister is coming, and an upcoming US-Japan comprehensive space dialogue. So how do you view, what's the role of bilateral engagements like this on orbit, and how do you see them kind of feeding into these broader discussions that we've been talking about?
All dialogue is good. We must just make sure that we don't lose trust through fragmentation. Whether it's industry going off to do its own thing, if it's a group of countries doing their own thing and taking their own initiative, dialogue and bringing people together is always good, but we mustn't lose trust. So openness and transparency is really valuable. And personally, when I saw the question that you had about the US and Japan, I'm trying to encourage our Japanese delegation to be a little bit more bold, because they are leading when it comes to active debris removal with Astroscale. They're leading in all of the thought process and work that they have done to come up with guidelines for the first global license for active debris removal. There are so many critical legal questions that need to be asked when you're talking about removing a piece of debris from space. And they've done all of that thinking. If we want to scale that, because we know we need to scale debris removal, then we need to share that knowledge with a much broader range of member states and hope that we can foster many more of them to implement those, to come up with similar guidelines and licenses. But we have cultural differences. So whereas the US is not shy, our Japanese counterparts are more reserved and a little more timid. But where you have something to contribute and you know the issue is so important, we want to bring them out of their shell. So I hope that the US can also motivate the Japanese delegation to be a little bolder and to impart some of the very valuable work that they're doing and share it with other member states, particularly through COPAs. We have a legal subcommittee meeting coming up, and I have convinced the Japanese delegation to bring Astroscale, and also we're working on seeing if they can bring some legal experts from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to talk about their licensing process.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
The legal aspect of like active debris removal, we could talk for an hour about just that.
Indeed.
But we're nearing the end of our time. So to close on kind of a forward-looking note, you are fairly new to the job. So what have you learned in your time on the job so far? And now that you have been in the job and kind of gotten a feel for it, what are your top priorities going forward for the next year or so?
We spent the first, I say we, myself and my deputy, we're a new leadership team since 6 months. We spent the first 4 months really listening to member states and trying to collect our thoughts around what are the priorities. We presented a strategy to member states which has 5 pillars. The first one is space sustainability, obviously. I mean, every member state said the same thing. They may have different priorities, but they all said the same objectives: space sustainability, space for climate change, space for the SDGs. How do we make a difference in developing countries? Spotlight on Africa, and fundamentally, how do we leverage engagement with the private sector to accelerate progress on all of these issues? So those are our priorities. I need to focus on making sure that the office is equipped with the right skill set and the appropriate resources to be able to really embark properly on each one of these strands. But I also want to make sure that we are advancing in the near term at the upcoming COPA meetings on critical issues. So lunar coordination, for example, that's a big one. We've seen at the last ITU World Radio Conference in November last year in Dubai, the ITU is moving forward with an agenda item on lunar communications, as they should. Absolutely vital. COPUS, however, needs to look at the broader coordination. How do we share data? How do we ensure that missions don't crash with each other? How do we ensure we don't put multiple navigation systems around the moon or multiple communications around the moon, because the moon is 1/6 of the size of the Earth, right? So there's so many different areas where the committee needs to advance now. And so my priority is making sure that we are helping member states realize the weight of responsibility that lies on their shoulders, and that they are not a hidden committee tucked away in Vienna, which many people knew nothing about, that they are now, the spotlight is on them and the world is waiting for them to deliver. But we can't do that without the support of individual member states. The US is a really important one of them. So really look forward to moving forward on all of this, also with US support.
Well, great. We are unfortunately out of time. I know this has been really, really interesting for me. You obviously have a lot on your plate. So thank you for being here today to talk about it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit to the US.
Thank you.
Get out to Colorado next week. And thank you so much again to the Atlantic Council for hosting. Thank you to our audience here in the room and to everyone watching online.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.